Here we go. Scientific principles of strength training. To be clear, this is not like the Pirates Bay version where I read off everything so that you don't have to. Like now you don't have to buy the book. I actually recommend that you do. And if they sold this in like a hardcover, I'd absolutely have it on my shelf. I looked, I have it in PDF. I don't have it, or sorry, in the Kindle version. I don't have it in hardcover or in paperback. I don't think they offer it like that. But it's an asset. It's meaty. It's over 300 pages, 370 pages. Is what it's showing right here. Little bigger font, some graphs, some pictures, some visuals. But all in all, it's a meaty book. It's not something you're going to get through in one sitting. And it's definitely something that merits rereading because, as the book points out, this is not the simplistic approach. This is addressing the complexity, trying to build a worldview. And that's another thing I appreciate. I appreciate when people aim to have like a concrete, cohesive worldview, because that's how you know your shit's right. Because if something doesn't fit, either there's a problem with your information or there's a problem with the way you're interpreting it. So that's the only way we can reliably predict what the right answer is going to be. And that's how you build over time. That's how you build a discipline. You have to have something cohesive and concrete to build off of. And a lot of people don't. It's gut instinct, or they wing it, or they make it up as they go. So there is definitely a worldview of training that Renaissance periodization has, that the Juggernaut system has, that a lot of these guys have aimed to establish and perpetuate over time. So it's not just, oh, hey, here's a neat thing I tried in the gym. You can try it too. It's not, hey, here's 4 random hacks you can intermittently throw into your training at will, and it maybe should probably do something. Everything here is very cohesive and put together. So I'm a fan of that. So this is just a reaction to a couple of points in the book. I'm going to give you like a little bit of the overview and zero in on a couple of things I thought were of note. So here we have the cover. Chad Smith with a loaded barbell on his back. This is Chad back in the beefy days. These were the good old days before Chad went all Universal Soldier and dropped a bunch of weight to become a jiu-jitsu machine and probably feel better and live longer, but who cares about that? We miss Beefy Chad. I actually met Chad a handful of times. Never really talked, but I did meet him a couple times at various meets. Either he was judging or that we were competing at together, or that I was watching. And standing next to him, he reminds me of a character from like Five Nights at Freddy's or whatever that Nick Cage movie was, where he kills all the animatronic animals in like the Chuck E. Cheese knockoff. He looked like a giant Care Bear, but in the most like intimidating way, because he wasn't excessively tall. He's a tall dude, but he's not like half Thor tall or Brian Shaw tall. But he was so thick. He was just so like thick joints, thick shoulders, just thick everything. And it was just funny to watch because he's kind of unassuming on camera, and in person you stand next to him and it's like putting a little planet next to a bigger planet. It's like you can feel the gravity. Anyways, that was my Chad Smith story. Hope you enjoyed. So getting into the book, oh, there's Mike Israel. Oh, Mike Israel with hair. So glad you shaved your head. I had no idea you're that like eye to nose ratio compared to like eye to forehead. Shaving your head was a good move, bro. James Hoffman contributed here. The whole book feels like it was written by Israel. The whole book. I don't know to what degree these other guys contributed, but I read it in Mike's voice. I read it in his kind of nerdy science voice with the intermittent fucks thrown in, the dick jokes. Oh, Chad Smith. Okay, here's a guy who you know was too excited to take pictures during high school. When they would do like senior pictures or yearbook pictures, that face says like, I'm really happy to be here. I just can't with that. So getting down to like the nuts and bolts of the book, it starts out in the preface. It talks about what this book will not be. And that's a theme of the book, which again, I kind of like. It's like what it is, what it isn't. You know, here's a principle. Here's what the principle is. Here's when you do too much. Here's when you do too little. A lot of feeling out the extremes to kind of establish what truth is in the middle. But it starts out, here's what the book will not be. And there's a part before that talks about what it is. Keep it simple, stupid. Now I take that as a personal attack because that's come out of my mouth so many times. Now, when you're reading this, and it is important you know this when you get into it, this is a book that covers details. But it covers details in a way that connects a web that fits together in a very rational and cohesive way. And it also addresses order of magnitude. And that's something I really appreciate. It's not, here's a list of random shit you should be paying attention to in whatever order you happen to find it important. It's, here's these principles and here's the degree to which each one matters. So really make sure you focus on this, and this stuff, as you get better, you'll have time to focus on it as this other stuff becomes automatic. Or if you miss it here, it's not that big of a deal if this, and this is taken care of. So it's important to know that going in. A lot of times I am hypercritical because it's the first thing I notice when there's too much specialization and when there's too much just reveling in the minutia. Like, oh my God, how much can we talk about these tiny little things that we kind of sort of maybe can pull out of this obscure study? I do have a lot of appreciation when the finer details are addressed in a way that makes a big picture fit more, because then everything becomes a lot more intuitive. So it's not keep it simple, stupid, though that stuff is also relevant when you're talking about a certain type of lifter. Not everybody needs competition prep. Not everybody needs periodization in certain blocks. Not everybody needs to know what a meso is. If you train for fun, if you're recreational, if you're new, God help you, which most of you are. If you're new, you don't need a lot of this stuff. You might benefit from being educated in it, but you don't need it right now. You can do bare bones basic stuff that checks the big boxes. And in that scenario, keep it simple, stupid is going to keep you from wasting time doing gimmicky bullshit. So that is my take on that. He says it's not minimalist. Again, I love minimalist stuff because it can solve a lot of problems for the recreational lifter. When time is limited, when attention is limited, when you don't have the time, the ability, or the care to look into all of these higher-minded training principles, you can still get very strong and very muscular by focusing on minimalist principles, simple principles. You just have to run that a specific way. It's a different lean. But I absolutely think anybody that's going to be competitive, that wants to win, has to break out of that eventually. So that's important to know. And it's not cookie cutter. This is very much principally based. I mean, a lot of works claim to not be cookie cutter, but at some point they all have to be. And it's just a matter of at which threshold is it cookie cutter. This has its own principles, but that gives it a particular lean. You have to put something to the wall. You have to peg something to the wall when you're talking about training, because there is so much variation, so many different schools of thought. So this, implies that this method of training concerns itself with, let's say, total number of sets per week. Well, that speaks to the ways that you're going to potentially arrange your training. And it has certain patterns embedded. It recommends waving up effort over a mesocycle. That's a particular pattern. It recommends a certain arrangement of exercises. That's a particular pattern. So it's not cookie cutter and like, here's these sets, reps, etc. Here's the weight, here's that workout. You're all going to go do this. No, it does give you plenty of room to fill in the gaps. But there's always something that's kind of cookie cutter, because this method of training is going to be different than if you're a Westside fanboy. And that's going to be different than if you're a Sheiko fan and you love hyper specialized Olympic lifting inspired approaches to powerlifting. So there are different schools of thought and they all have their own templates to follow. This one is no different, but everything has to set itself apart some way. It covers important terms, which I appreciate. Priorities, that's a big one here. And this is basically like the table of contents after the table of content. The whole book goes chapter by chapter with basically training variables, and it breaks each one down. And this is the important part. It talks about order of importance, order of magnitude, specificity, then overload, then fatigue management. And by the way, these are things you can find in articles that they've written. It's not like this is information that's proprietary to the book or that you have to buy the book to get. So again, I'm not giving away any trade secrets here. I'm just giving you an overview. The depth that they go into in each individual variable, pretty impressive. Like, I got to say, they do a really good job. And Mike is entertaining enough, again, assuming it's Mike's voice that I hear. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume that Mike wrote most of this. It is entertaining. The end of the book finishes off with a quote from Prince Vegeta. to Dragon Ball Z fans. So there's always a kind of levity that keeps it from getting too rote, too formal, too mechanical. And I definitely appreciate that. Oh, that's familiar. There's a good old SRA, stress recovery adaptation. I'd like to hear some of the nerds chime in about how different this is from GAS, general adaptation syndrome, if they're two different curves, or if SRA is the curve that it is used to explain GAS. I don't really know. And this is where sciencey shit loses me when they quibble about little definitions. So as a little aside, somebody tried telling me that GAS was outdated and now we do the fatigue recovery paradigm or something like that. And I looked it up and it was basically a GAS curve with a bunch of extra mini curves thrown in. And the whole assumption was that, well, you don't have to wait for this entire recovery process to perform because certain structures recover sooner and some actually adapt immediately. And it was this whole convoluted way of basically saying that it's not this one dimensional, which of course everybody knows. And digging into this doesn't really give you any new information to work with. It's like, okay, this explains why you can train with higher frequency, I guess. But anyways, it was another way of these institutions trying to do more with the exact same information. It didn't give any more information. There's nothing else you can do or any new conclusions you can come to with this new way of looking at things. And it made my head want to explode. It's like, tell me you haven't made any advancements in the field without telling me you haven't made any advancements in the field. Let's keep quibbling about really abstract conceptual ideas that don't give us any more power to get things done. This curve is very simple, very conceptual. It's just you train, there's a dip in performance, you begin to recover, you adapt, which makes you better than you were. And if you don't do anything else, eventually that dissipates and you revert back to your set point. You revert back to normal. And the goal is obviously to stack these on top of each other. And that's something you take into account when you're trying to figure out how much stress you need to get that adaptive response and how much recovery you need to make it sustainable so you don't train yourself into the ground. So very simple, straightforward stuff. It does not require more insight or explanation. You're not going to do better than this. Training is a balance between stress and recovery. I've said it 5 million times. I will continue to say it. Things that they cover from a technical aspect that I'm really a fan of. I mean, talk about choosing lifting styles for your body types. They go into anthropomorphy. They talk about some of the things that will influence recovery. Like there's a thought that different lifters being exposed to the same exact stress are going to experience it differently. Go figure. And that might have implications for how we collect data and analyze the effects of these stressors. Like, yes, that is extremely important and something not enough people pay attention to. Level of advancement is important. Your build is important. How efficient you are, how much overload you can get on your body relative to your height, your weight, your frame. That all comes into play. And you can give some pretty useful generalized recommendations for volume. I don't like digging into them. A lot of people will say like, oh, such and such. Prilipin's chart's a good starting point. Well, first of all, no the fuck it's not. Prilipin's chart is Olympic lifting data, specifically from elite lifters, that is very vague and open-ended. So no, that is not a good starting point. But you can take similar data, or at least data that's arranged the same way, or recommendations that are arranged the same way, that most coaches and lifters in the field agree upon. And you can see this spread, and you can see this kind of bracketed range you can work into where you can start to collect information and then start applying it to yourself as an individual. That is the most high-minded, big brain shit you can do, because that is going to guarantee the right answer. The only problem is the downside is tailoring things to yourself requires time, effort, attention. And if you don't do it well, or if you half-ass it, that will still get you the wrong answer. So that's kind of the difference between really blanketed stuff that is so vague it's designed to cast a wide net versus the ultimate in training knowledge, which is going to concern itself with you. Remember, it's entirely different to make conclusions over what an entire lifting team might experience. It's like, hey, I have 100 lifters pre-selected for talent. If we have them do X, Y, or Z, we will get 3 or 4 gold medalists. Hey, that's great. Oh, but 3/4 of them dropped off for injury. Well, that's different than, and those conclusions are different than if I say hey you, I want to do what's best for you, what's going to get you as close to the podium as possible. And that involves some guessing and some trial and error and figuring out where you fall on the spectrum. And it might even involve some risk. It might even involve approaches that may give more return, but may also sacrifice something else that you want to preserve. And it's this balancing act. And that's really important to know. They talk about choosing your best MRV, maximum recoverable volume. You know you made it when you have an entire nomenclature and an entire jargon based around your presence in the field. So it's pretty cool that they have, I mean, it's cut and dry. It's a pretty simple conceptual idea. Here's the minimum amount of work. Here's the most amount of work. But they do bring it down to a more accessible range because coaches in other fields and other parts of the world, they're going to be looking at like tonnage and average intensity and number of lifts. Volume is going to mean 100 different things, and they might have their own calculation for volume. But volume is going to be, it could be total tonnage, just multiplying all the work, all the sets and reps by all the weight. It could be number of lifts. It could be number of working sets. Then you have to set your threshold. Some people only count a working set as being at a certain RPE. Boris Shako counts everything above like 50%. So you're talking about RPEs 2, 3s, and 4s counting towards total volume. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. They make it accessible because they mainly concern themselves with number of sets done at a certain RPE. And I think for most of the population, I think that's just fine. I don't think it has to be more complex than that. Myths, fads, and fallacies. I got to get to that. That's going to be at the end. Quite a few things that they went through at the end. And that was kind of a bonus because it was general commentary on basically things Mike thinks is bullshit, which I enjoyed. That did absolutely add something to the book. So the rest of the book, it's going line by line. I mean, the meat of the book, and like I said, it is meaty. It merits a thorough read through, probably several times, referring back to it during a cycle, referring back to it at the end, referring back to it in subsequent cycles. I promise that most of you are probably going to pull out more gems as time goes on, and it's going to, again, congeal into this cohesive way of looking at training. And I do think if you were to commit to a school of thought, one, that's the best way to get good. So if you are dedicated to being competitive, you have to limit how much experimentation and discovery you do and just training for funsies, just doing this program and that ebook and that. And I want to do a little bit of everything. That's great if you're recreational, if stress management and blowing off steam is just as important to you as actually getting big and jacked and being stimulated and having fun. That's great. You can take that approach and it will still be productive. If you want to get good, you need to at some point commit to a school of thought, to a method of training that has a robust amount of information and experience behind it, that has people that you can talk to, other lifters, other coaches you can consult that have a handle on it, because that will give you the tightest, most pointed arrow towards your end goals. So if you're going to commit to a style of training, I think this one is very accessible. I think it's very proven. I think it's just as good as any other possible approach to lifting that you possibly could take. And there is a very common sense ideology behind it. So every answer, every solution is there with regards to how you might tweak your training. And that's very powerful. Are you limited in the sense that you're not going to be doing everything? Yes, but that's the point. Like, no, you're not going to fit conjugate style principles into this. Like, no, you're not going to be able to do a one-off 20 rep squat just because you feel like it. No, you're not going to be doing extremely high frequency like your favorite Bulgarian lifters did, as if you could even handle that workload if you tried it. So again, I am a fan of the way that everything gets explained. It's more intuitive. Couple notches above in complexity from what you're probably used to reading, but worth it. And the other thing is a lot of these principles, I talked about some things being fixed to the wall. Most of these principles apply in some way to other programs as well. So being able to keep that straight, I think, is very important. cutting all of the meat, because again, I'm not just giving the cliff notes here. This isn't so you don't have to buy the book. I mean, God damn it. Go spend a little bit of money. It's $9.99. I'm pretty sure this was a lot more expensive when it first came out. This is an easy $10 to spend that will benefit you. Cutting to the end, I do want to get to the myths, fallacies, and fads, because that has some more things that I think I can respond to. Not feel guilty like I'm giving away the meat and potatoes of the book. Oh, God. Oh, bands and chains for raw powerlifting. Number one, man after my own heart, going straight forward. And you can tell there is a little bit of West Side bias here. And I really enjoy reading through a lot of the higher, or a lot of the more established minds in kind of general powerlifting culture, because you'll see, not from everybody, but there are a handful of people who you see this thread of disdain where they won't come out and say, I think West Side is bullshit, Louie Simmons has his head up his ass. Not that I think he outright does, or that anybody does, but you will see this like hidden passive aggressive disdain where they will in a roundabout way address certain aspects that kind of pick apart that school of thought. And I like mean girl drama, and I sniff it out where I can, because these guys are professionals. They don't come out with it. They don't come out and slap their rivals in the face with their glove. They bury it. They bury it deep in these little nuggets into their content that you have to really, really pay attention to find. They're like little Easter eggs. So bands and chains for raw powerlifting. Goes on a nice rant about bands and chains. Interestingly enough, I heard an interview, an older one, before Fred Hatfield passed away, that he did with Josh Bryant. And Josh asked him about accommodating resistance, about bands and chains. And Fred said that in the 50s and 60s they were around, they just didn't get used a lot. So, and Fred Hatfield is a big compensatory acceleration guy, as in speed work, but he likes it as in hitting the gas on all your reps, not specifically this narrow light range of training. Anyways, but there was a bit of not disdain, but disagreement, at least in Hatfield's voice, when it came to overloading the top. And he's like, really the bottom of the lift for a raw lifter is by and large the most important part. And it doesn't make sense to sacrifice that to overload the top, because that typically isn't the weak point for raw lifters. You all have to start assuming that the bottom position is the most important, because if you don't take care of that, the rest doesn't really matter. So Mike goes into it at the end, myths, fallacies, and fads. Obviously, this is a fad. For the better part of a decade, we're inundated with information about training for powerlifting that made it seem as if bands and chains were nearly a necessity for maximizing strength and performance for powerlifting. And Mike, of course, disagrees. He says, overloading the top end, rarely necessary for the raw lifter. You don't see a lot of raw benches being missed at lockout. Squats almost never. Deadlifts are rare. Now, they do happen, but the people that have those issues are usually very, very advanced lifters who have a setup that usually is lopsided with regards to how well they can do at the start. I saw Leroy Walker miss a 700-pound bench attempt 3/4 of the way from lockout. It was insane. He has so much speed off his chest, and he trains that. He would always talk about high volume, almost like a bodybuilder, as fast as he could go off the chest. And he used a narrow grip to get a lot of compression. And that led to very tight off the chest, a lot of speed off the chest. But once the bar slowed down, he didn't often have the gas to sustain that effort throughout the entire range. But that's not something you tend to see in most lifters, because most lifters, they're just going to feed into the strength curve, which is that you are stronger with every inch that that bar gets closer to lockout. Mechanically, your advantage. So an untrained lifter is going to experience that. So I think the implication is, as long as you're well-rounded and your training isn't lopsided, that shouldn't be an issue. With squats, that's never an issue unless you lose your balance. With deadlifts, I tend to think missing at lockout is a lot more coordination. You don't know how to extend your hips adequately, or you get into a shitty position when the bar's at your knees, so you lose that power. That's just me anyways. So there's a nice little rant about bands and chains that I thought was funny. Super high frequency for everyone. That's another one. Yeah, it's trendy now for powerlifters to come in, bypass what used to be the kind of trial by fire back in the day, where they would start out in some shitty corporate gym, reading muscle magazines, doing basic fitness or bodybuilding inspired training, get a well-rounded physique, adapt to a lot of volume and higher reps, get comfortable training with high levels of intensity. And the type of training didn't make that counterproductive because you don't need your CNS prime to be able to recover for your bis and tris workout. You just need hard efforts that are stacked consistently on top of each other. So that used to be how most people got their foot in the water and set them up nicely for when they transferred over to a barbell. Now, a lot of people are getting their hands on barbells first and jumping straight into this specialized, over specific approach. And now everybody's favorite thing is to do like squat, bench, dead only programs where each lift is 3 or 4 times a week. And it's all heavily RPE focused and it gets really convoluted. And I think honestly, for most people, it's unwarranted. I think it's more complicated than it needs to be. And I think you miss out on a lot of easy key development stuff by having just a slightly greater chunk of your training represented by accessory work. Now, super high frequency, you're talking about 4 days a week, 5 days a week. Bulgarian, that is like a shit that it won't die. It is like a shit that just never turns white and stops stinking. It's just there stinking up the place for as long as people remember it exists. Bulgarian system will be in people's minds and people will periodically try to make it popular. John Bros, I remember 10, 12 years ago, maybe longer, when he was training Pat Mendez. Dude, Pat Mendez, he's on, 90 Day Fiance now? Holy hell. I don't know if that's a win for him. I don't know if he's not doing well. Does somebody need to check on him? Lifting phenom, like 19 or 20, hitting 800-pound ass-to-grass squat, no belt, no sleeves. Absolutely ridiculous. But he was coached by John Bros, who was trained by Antonio Krastev, who had the snatch record for years as part of the Bulgarian team. And they bought into the Kool-Aid, squat every day to a single, every damn day. And that was a fad for a couple of years. People talked about John and they would interview him and he'd be like, well, it's like picking up a labor job. It sucks at the beginning, then you get used to it. I would say not entirely like that, but it worked for the people that could survive. And that's the big thing. Similarly with the Bulgarian system, I touched on this. This is a lot of people that are disposable because they're part of a group. The group doing well by means of a couple of people getting to the podium. That's all that matters. Everybody in the group is disposable. The group is already pre-selected for their talent. What a lot of people don't know is the Bulgarian system is these guys had to pay their dues with traditional training before they ended up doing the daily max bullshit. So these are guys that did the 70 to 80% gig for a long time, got good, then were selected to go towards this more aggressive run of training in a bid to outpace bigger countries. And that's what happened. Also, most of the guys were small. Mike points this out in his write-up. They were small lifters. These weren't super heavyweights. And this goes back to choosing lifts and methodologies based on your body type, because bigger, heavier people, they're going to be lifting bigger weights, which means a bigger stress, which means recovery not quite as straightforward. It tends to be that lighter lifters recover better than bigger ones. So you can fill in the blank why you think that's the case. That just tends to be what we observe. So it's not one size fits all, not based on experience, not based on build, certainly not based off activity. Powerlifting is different than Olympic lifting. Yes, indeed it is. So just taking Olympic lifting approaches and principles and grafting it on powerlifting and calling it good, not great, not an awesome approach, I think. I think there's some gaps in there. But yeah, for the average person, I mean, the type of person that would watch that video or buy a book and try to implement it, these are recreational or amateur lifters. They are not competitive. They're not under the eye of a coach. No matter how desperately they will do anything to get an ounce of strength, really they won't. And they shouldn't pretend as if they are, and they shouldn't be encouraged to follow through that mindset, because that's how you spend a lot of years to get really chewed up and not get very strong. So that's my take on that. So all in all, I mean, there's like 10 more of these that he goes through. Like I said, I didn't give away the plot on the book. Well, I gave away the plot. I didn't give away the plot twist. Like I said, this is a very meaty read. It is worth having. It is worth looking over multiple times. So I recommend people check it out. And I recommend, even if you don't implement the RP style of training, the Renaissance periodization approach, if you follow some different methodology that you've been digging into, I think that's fine. But I also think that this is going to fill in a lot of gaps with regards to questions you might have, problems you might have. So keep that in mind. I think this is a very valuable resource. It's a book I recommend for just about everybody. I'm going to keep this thread up because honestly, I think it's interesting. And I think this is another way I can give some value to you guys while still kind of giving the names of people that are net assets, for people that have a lot to give their viewer base in terms of information and direction, as if Israel needs clicks from me, right? But that's important to me, is to try and curate a collection of who the legit guys are, or at least who's spreading meaningful information and principally based stuff. It's in the book, Scientific Principles. I don't care that any of this does or doesn't pop up in a study. And the way he lays it out, it doesn't even seem that relevant that he does. It seems like it backs up a lot of things that we've already kind of surmised from trial and error and from a century of this discipline being around. But it's the principles. It's the little bits that are static. They don't change, and they contribute to the base off which all of our training decisions are based off of. And I think that's huge. So big fan of this book. Recommendations. If there's people you would like to see me review, people with books or resources that are at least somewhat easy to track down and investigate, I am looking for recommendations there. I recognize a little too late that Josh Bryant's on Kindle Unlimited, so I recommend everybody check him out. I'm going to be doing a deep dive into Josh Bryant pretty soon because I'm a big fan of his approach. And there's an interesting kind of bleed over to what these guys do. Josh Bryant trained Chad Smith for a brief time. I don't think Chad liked that training very much, but Josh Bryant trained a bunch of absolute monsters, and I resonate a lot with a lot of the principles he says, some of which connect very tightly to this, some of which diverge a little bit, and it's worth getting into. So thank you so much, everybody, for sticking around for this long lecture. It's basically a glorified Bromley Reacts video. But any questions, any recommendations you have, comments, leave them in the Base Strength Facebook forum. It's absolutely free. We're closing in on 1,000 members to that group, guys. I'm a sucker for these arbitrary milestones. Go ahead and join up. Get us over 1,000 and interact with some of the people there. We have a lot of educated people who are very active, who give a lot of good information. It's very good dialogue that goes on in there on a daily basis. And I routinely post and comment as well. You can support me through Patreon or the YouTube memberships page. I think I'm going to beta test a Patreon feature where we do some group coaching. It's going to be a little watered down. They're $5 and $10 tiers, but I think I'm going to have a weekly program updated for people that want to follow along. And it's a social media platform so people can communicate and, troubleshoot and investigate there. So I'm going to kickstart that in a little bit. But regardless, this information always ends up on Patreon first, and it ends up on YouTube and the podcast platform later. So keep that in mind. Thank you, everybody, for your support. If you haven't, check out Base Strength on the Empire Barbell Store or on Amazon. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you. Oh, yeah, and go buy Mike's book. Don't be lazy. Go buy Mike's book. Read it. It's good for you. You spent $50 on that protein you didn't need and on a bunch of supplements. You probably spent $30 on branched-chain amino acids, which don't do a goddamn thing. $9.99. Scientific Principles of Strength Training. Do it. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.